Hey, everybody. Welcome to the family meeting. Come on in. Today, we are going to talk about power and authority, biblical authority, and that word kind of being used in conjunction with one another, but looking at what does the Bible say about authority and justice. And we're going to do so in light of this whole Tyre Nichols situation. I put out a couple of days ago when I first heard that the video was going to release and I heard about the situation that as believers, we are called first to pray. We need to wait for evidence before rendering judgment and all of that. And so now that the video has released and there's a little bit more just information or evidence, I think that it would be safe to not necessarily render judgment on this case, but to look at how power can become corrupt, the perils of power. And this isn't the perils of power in regards to policing specifically, but what are some of the issues that come when someone has power? And how do we navigate power biblically? I personally don't believe that power is a negative thing. People are always saying you need to speak truth to power as if power is automatically corrupt or unjust. I do not believe that. I believe we have many biblical precedents for power, that power can be a good thing when wielded correctly and righteously. And yet, that power can cause an entire people group to be, miserable when it is wielded unjustly and for wicked gain. And so I am going to be joined tonight by my brothers, Eric Muldrow and from Code Red Conversations, and Kevin Briggins, my podcast partner from Off Code. And we're just going to chop it up. We're just going to talk about some things. Please join in the chat. Let us know where you're watching from. I'm going to actually turn on the chat so I can see what's going on. Cool. And we're just going to talk now. I told them before we hopped on that I have an hour because I have class tonight. You guys, I can push it maybe to like 5:15. Hopefully, I'm not late for class. I don't want to be late for class and my teacher be like, "Where are you at?" But we're just gonna chop it up. We actually will probably pick up where we left off before we hopped on. So if we can bring Kevin and Eric out. Well, what's up, y'all?
Hey, how's it going?
Up.
Good. Thank you for joining.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Yep.
Good. Now,
Welcome to Off Code. Oh, never mind. Wrong
this
podcast.
ain't off code. This ain't off code. Before we even get started, because everybody knows me and Kevin, I will have Eric tell you a little bit about himself and some of his credentials. But I want to encourage you not right now, not now, but like when we're done, to go to Code Red Conversations on YouTube and subscribe to his page. Y'all need to follow Eric Muldrow. You need to understand the information that he's giving out just from his history and his background, which he will tell you about. But like, y'all don't sleep on Eric. Go and subscribe to his channel, like his page, and follow him. All right, Eric, you up.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Once again, I'm thankful. I appreciate y'all having me on so we can discuss this issue. It's obviously it's on the top of everyone's mind and understandably so. A little bit about me. I'm a 21-year retired law enforcement officer. My career started in 1992 after I got out of the U.S. Army, where I served as a combat medic. I began working at Westville Correctional Center in Westville, Indiana, a maximum security prison. Worked there for about 3 years. If you want to hear some interesting stories, hit me up at another time. I'm sure I can fill your ear with some pretty interesting discussions on that matter. In 1996, I moved to Las Vegas. Me and my family, I hired on with the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. Worked at the Clark County Detention Center for 10 years, which was all under the banner of LVMPD, Las Vegas Metro Police. In 2006, I just decided I wanted to do something a little different. So I just tested to be a patrol officer, went out to the streets, and graduated the academy in 2007. And I spent the remaining 7 years or so of my career as a patrol officer. During my time as in in the capacity of a law enforcement officer under Metro, I was a defensive tactics, firearms, active shooter, response instructor. I worked under gang intelligence. I was a terrorism liaison officer. I had some tremendous opportunities to do some pretty cool things. And I retired in 2014. 2018, I decided, with all the conversations about police use of force and people having an opinion one way or another, I decided just to put my hat in the conversation, considering my background and my knowledge base. And I just started, chiming in on it from a perspective of not just simply speculation, but from someone who actually worked in that capacity, but also trained other officers to how to use a firearm properly, how to apply force in various scenarios properly. So, and here I am today. Here I am with y'all right now, joining in on this conversation, this very much needed conversation.
Well, thank you for being here. You've been on All the Things with Krista and me, and we have laid out your credentials. And so I just want to, encourage everyone again, go and make sure that you have liked Eric's page, subscribe to his YouTube page, because the information that he's talking about is extremely pertinent, especially as we're having conversations about defunding the police and police reform. And, are all police unjust and are all police a part of a crooked system that's just built upon whiteness? And are Black people being plucked off by the police, just randomly plucked off? And now we have to be in fear of going outside of our homes. I think that was something, mentioned in 2020 by one of the athletes, maybe LeBron James, but
It was LeBron.
yeah. So, Eric is addressing these issues. And as Christians, we are to stay, knowledged up. Like, we need to be able to go to evidence before we just go to speculation or before we just believe what someone else is saying. And
Amen.
So my encouragement to you is to follow Code Red Conversations and Eric, so that you can stay evidenced. You're not staying built on speculation.
Let me just throw this in there real quick.
Go ahead.
I'm also lately branching out and discussing more worldview issues, like pop culture issues, from a biblical perspective. So, I've been branching out a little bit more so someone comes along simply with the idea, oh, I'm just going to learn about policing related issues. You're going to get that, but there's so many other topics that I think the church, and it's going to be one point that we're going to be addressing today, I think the church should be speaking on. And, so I've kind of undertaken that, stepped into that area as well.
Somebody, Allison on here, say you can also give fitness tips.
Yeah, I know a little something about fitness. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, go ahead.
Something about it. I was a personal trainer at one point. I had a little business where I was a personal trainer. I'm like big time into the keto diet. Like, if y'all had saw me around this time in 2018, brother was just looking nasty. So, I had to get it right. I kind of went through a little spell there for about 4 years where I wasn't right, but, I'm down about 60 pounds,
Okay.
52, about to be 53 with a 6-pack. I ain't bragging or nothing, but, I'm doing all right.
Go ahead, man. Let the Lord use you. You go ahead. My auntie Lisa on here. Lisa Spencer on here. Okay. Latanya's on here. All right, y'all. Okay, let's jump in. Now I do want to pick up where we left off before we hopped on, but I want to give this this encouragement, or just kind of lay out where we're going first. The first thing that we want to do is create a standard by which this conversation will be had. And so when we're looking at power or authority and justice, what are the biblical tenets, definitions, scriptures where we can find, conversation on biblical justice, or ideas on biblical justice and the biblical use of authority? And so you can bring the guys back in, because they'll be able to chime in too. And so when we are looking at what happened with Tyre Nichols, we can see much injustice, but how do we know that it wasn't injustice? if we don't have a standard by which we are measuring justice, we can't necessarily say, well, that was unjust. I might say, in my heart, that don't feel right. But as believers, we actually have a standard that says, no, this is an injustice. And what happens when there is injustice? And so I don't know if you guys want to offer any thoughts about like a biblical definition of justice or of authority. I'm going to use the word authority more so than power, just because of how power and authority are differentiated in the scriptures. Authority is more, that word is used more in relation to man and our sphere or relationship with each other. And power is usually more so specifically used in relation to God and his creation and his relationship with man, how God is all powerful. And so that's kind of in some of my word study on the difference between power and authority. This is why I'm using the word authority, even though in culture people would say speak truth to power. That word power here in the Bible is translated more as authority. Do you guys want to offer any thoughts on a biblical definition of justice or authority?
Kevin, you want to chime in
Man,
anywhere?
I was gonna kick it to you.
Well, you know what? I was going to reference some text as regarding how it kind of plays out to some degree. Not so much as far as a definition. I wasn't prepared for that.
Yeah,
But
go
as
ahead.
far as like some text of how it applies to us as the body of Christ in the U.S., for instance, like we can reference like Romans 13. That's the one people typically go to. I think oftentimes it is forgotten in the midst of these conversations when we're dealing with the issue. And before I even go there, let me just say this, so no one misconstrues anything I say and takes anything I'm saying out of context. In regard to this whole Memphis situation, point blank, I think this was a horrendous, evil act that we saw. And in my mind, there is zero. I can't see any additional information coming out that will change my mind as to how evil and heinous this was, because you saw time and time again where if someone wanted to go there and say, Tyre Nichols should have done X, Y, Z. Okay, we can have that conversation down the road. But once there was an attempt to take him into custody, I saw nothing but an abuse of power. I saw nothing but officers using excessive force left and right. So I want to put that out there right now. And I pray to God, and I'm trusting that these individuals, 5, 7, however many there are when it's all said and done, will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. So I just want to say that just from the get-go, because I know at times as conversations go on, people may misconstrue the point I'm trying to make. But I just want to read through Romans chapter 13, verses 1-4, and with the primary focus of just trying to put, and there's some additional text, and we'll get to that hopefully. But let every person be subject to the governing authorities. This is the ESV I'm reading. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. So yeah, I'll just leave that up there right now. And of course, there's nuance to that. It doesn't. I don't believe, and y'all correct me or interject if you disagree, but it seems clear that this is a righteous government. We're being told if a government tells us to sin, then that it's not. We're not in a position to obey that government if a government is telling us to be in sin. But in general speaking, in general situations, we should be willing to obey. And I'll leave it there. I'll just let that hang. Like I said, there's some additional text that we can go into, but I'll just let y'all chime in on that.
Kevin, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I think that was a good place to start in this conversation that's going on, because so many people are kind of questioning the authority of policing and the government in general. And I think we need to realize or lay out that the biblical position is that there are people, the government is put in authority over us, right? And so there is an authority there that the government is given, and it is to carry out justice. It is to carry out the sword against those who do wrong. Um, but the government is supposed to do that in a way that is righteous and just, right?
Yeah.
Amen.
It is supposed
Amen.
to do that from a position of fairness and a position of not abusing that authority that it has over the people, right? And so I think I agree 100% that what we saw was a complete abuse of that authority in that situation. As far as police videos go, this is probably the worst video I've ever seen. To me, this was way worse than Rodney King or George Floyd.
I agree.
There are no words for what we saw in those videos. I just can't explain it, what they were thinking and what they did. That was probably the most heinous abuse of power I've ever seen from law enforcement. You know,
What made it worse? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, brother.
No, go ahead.
What made it so bad was that you literally saw a man getting beat to death. Like we literally saw that. As bad as the George Floyd video was, and the Rodney King video was, and then you saw, not only did you see that, but then you heard the conversation of them acting as if they were so nonchalant about it. Took the body camera off, sat it down, bragging, laughing about it. It just showed, if there's ever any debate, and I don't want to get into this conversation, but if there's ever any question about the depravity of man, it was on full display, like right there in front of us. You saw what can be the evils that can lie in the heart of every man, and I say every man, regardless of skin color. Mm-hmm. It's there, lurking in the background.
So when we talk about authority, when we talk about justice, you guys have already, like, Romans 13 was where I was going to go there, that someone is an authority when they have someone under them, when there are people who are subject to them now, or someone that they have influence over. And so when we look in scripture, we see authority figures, we see parents, we see husbands, we see civil magistrates and governments and all of those things. Eric, you hit it on the head when you said, this is talking about a righteous government. Acts 5, when it said talks about, we must obey God rather than man, when the government is calling for us to do something that is antithetical to our beliefs as Christians, to what the scriptures command us to do. And when we look at justice, we're talking about the right treatment of others according to God's moral law. So this is the standard by which we're talking about, was something unjust happening to Tyre Nichols. Now, for anyone who has, not seen what we're referencing, let me give you a little bit of history. On January 7th, there was a man named Tyre Nichols who was pulled over for a traffic violation. After being pulled over and a brief police pursuit where he got out of his car and he fled, he was literally beaten, and he died 3 days later due to his injuries. The video of that has since been released. It was released, I want to say, last Friday. And so this is what we are talking about. And now, going to all that you have said, yes, we, the word in Romans says that the government is meant to protect the people. It is meant to uphold, to restrain evil, basically. And how does it restrain evil and protect its people from evil, except by wielding the sword to offer that punishment? And so now I feel like we have some of the wording and terms out of the way. I think you guys have already hit on a lot of what people are wondering, like, was this horrible? Was this an injustice? Yes, it was an injustice. I don't feel no ways about saying that, from the biblical perspective and definition, this was an injustice. What Yeah, that's where I was going to go to next. Sorry, Krista's over here also chiming in. But my next question to you, Eric, is from a policing perspective, how do you see this as being an injustice? As someone, who's gone into communities and has had to, wield the sword, so to say.
I can go so many places with that, but I would say first and foremost, and when we reflect or when we refer to certain issues and we understand it from a policing perspective, we understand that after you finish your academy and you go through your field training or your on-the-job training, you swear an oath to uphold the laws of the Constitution and of the city or state that you're working under, and that you are giving a job to quote unquote protect and serve. That's your job. And it's to protect and serve the citizens against anyone who would seek to do them harm. And it becomes even worse, or becomes even more scary, when you see a police officer who is the one who's wielding his power carelessly. And in this fashion, careless is an understatement. So I see that when you're entrusted in a community to be the one that people can pick up the phone and call, and that you come there and you're the one who acts on their behalf to protect them, to keep them healthy. And then you see, to keep them healthy, to keep them whole, keep them safe. And then you see an officer or a group of officers who roll up into a situation like a bunch of thugs, and then they inflict so much harm on someone to the point of death. Or even if you didn't kill the guy, you're still seeing an abuse of power. You're still seeing that. So I say the greatest concern is just that the impact that it has overall, which leads to discussions like we're having today, or what you're hearing in certain aspects of our society. You have people who are using this. I've recently started hearing the defund the police conversation come back up again. I sat back and watched a 30-minute video from, I think Democracy Now! Or something like that, where these people were on, they were bringing up the conversation of defunding, abolishing the police, and various topics like that. The dangers, there's so many problems that result when you see an officer who abuses their authority or their power. I'm hoping I didn't go too far off a tangent. I hope I answered your question, Monique. If not, let me know.
No. I hear you. As I am hearing you speak, the question that comes to mind, and Kevin, please jump in. The question that comes to mind for me, I almost knocked my camera over, is, and Kevin, feel free to answer this too, is, right now we're looking at defund the police, and that, all the police are a part of wicked systems and system of whiteness and all of this. And yes, it is, I would definitely say it is heinous when any person loses their life in such an act of injustice.
Right.
But it makes me wonder, like, does this mean all police are a part of a wicked system, or are there, is there another way of looking at this? Do we defund every police station because of the acts of a few bad officers? You know what I mean? Like, I'm trying to thread through, how do we think about this from the biblical position in regards to power or authority and justice?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Anybody who calls for the defunding of the police or to abolish the police are completely ignorant to the depravity of man. If you think you can go in these not just the inner cities, but anywhere, but primarily the inner city, and you think you can remove all the police officers and not have anarchy and chaos, you have lost your mind. This whole thing about defunding the police it's completely coming from people who don't have a biblical framework of humanity and sin, and so this idea that this idea that it's some type of system and not just individual actions is made off of false pseudo sociology that people have bought into. And anytime some event like this happens, they use it as an example or as an opportunity to boast their fake philosophical beliefs. It's all just being opportunistic. We talked about before we came on how certain individuals seem to be very opportunistic when these things come up. They pop up in front of the camera. They start, saying their same rhetoric over and over again. They're just using these things to be opportunistic to push whatever they want to push, right? Because anybody with any ounce of reality or any ounce of integrity will tell you, if they spend any time in the inner city, that even though these things do happen, the police are not the biggest issue within those communities. When it comes to people's livelihood, their safety, it is, in some places, it is complete chaos and murder and gunshots every day and just fights every day and break-ins and stabbings. And it's a constant just culture and environment of violent behavior. And the police, in many cases, are doing the best they can. And in some cases, they are, like Eric said, coming in, acting like thugs themselves and being the biggest gang in the community. And so I do think that there needs to be a conversation about holding officers accountable, but we can't act like this is the major problem that is impacting lives, because that's what we're really talking about. We're talking about the lives of people in these communities. We want to talk like the police is the biggest factor in these people's lives, and it's just not the truth. And so I just want to say that and defend, because I know Eric's a former cop, and so people might say he might be trying to be biased, but no, I just want to come in and say that as someone who was not a cop, that the cops, even though they can have their issues, are not the biggest problem within those communities.
Well, I think you hit on a good point that, this is an issue of heart. And if we want to have any kind of quote unquote reform among police officers, if that is the area that we're looking, and I think there's a much larger conversation to be had that you're touching on. I completely agree that hearts have to be transformed first through the power of the gospel. But I don't know that I would say that systems aren't part of the issue too, because when we look at this whole, this squad of guys who beat Tyre, they were part of something called like the Scorpion unit that was supposed to be able to go into communities. Now, if this group of people, and this here is where I feel like we can have much conversation about systemic injustice and how systemic injustice does not have to be synonymous with white and white systems and things like that, because they themselves could have created, and I'm not saying they did, I don't know enough about it, but they could have created a system within the 5, 6, 7, however many of them that were a part of this unit that went into areas and neighborhoods and terrorized that. But that's not just because they're police. Anybody can get two people to collude. So when sinful hearts choose to collude toward wickedness, you can create a system. And so I wonder if maybe there was some sinful heart colluding, there that did create some kind of system. You know what I mean?
I think there were some issues in that unit, but I want to put some context too. Memphis is one of the most dangerous cities in America.
Yes.
Many lists I found the previous years, they had reached number 1 as the most dangerous city.
Right.
So this year they started like 4 different units. One was that Scorpion unit. One was a fugitive unit to track down fugitives. One was a auto theft unit. So they started like 4 different units. Murders were down 18% this year from last year. So we can't simply view these units through the actions of these individuals without realizing why they were put in place to begin with, and that they have had a good impact on the community with murders being down 18%. And so that's why I think the conversation can get lost in when we lose context of why was there even a need for this type of unit? Instead of saying, oh, the unit is the part of whiteness and systemic injustice, it's like, no, this unit was created out of necessity because people are murdering each other, right?
Yes.
And so I do think that these young men lost their way. I do think they got caught up in the power, the idea that you have to go in with a strong hand in that type of environment, right? And establish yourself. You know, I think they got caught up in it and it became a really bad culture, right? And so you can tell just about it, they were talking with each other. This was a normal thing. The guy talking, man, I was throwing haymakers. Like, that's a good thing.
Right.
Like I don't know. It was very disturbing how far they had gone down. It's almost like Eric, you were in the Army, so you'll understand. It's almost like somebody who's in a war zone too long, and they just really forget that the people that on the other side or the people that are around are human, right? They simply just become targets or whatever, you know. And so I think these young men lost their way. When you read about these young men, you don't think that they set out to intend to, you know, be this way or whatever, but somewhere down the line they got caught up in and they lost their way of the fact they were actually supposed to be policing and serving the community and not being the biggest thugs and gangs in the community. And so,
man,
Eric, what say you?
Kev is so on point, and it was something that I referenced. I'm not sure whether it was when my own video I did on my channel or when I was with John Harris on Conversations That Matter. But it was I brought up the fact that there can develop within an individual a mindset of an us against them mindset in law enforcement. When you're dealing with the criminal element over and over and over again, and you see what most people never see, you see the worst part of humanity. Just like you referenced, Kev, when you referenced the soldier who's becoming desensitized in a combat zone. I believe, and I've seen situations where cops have developed that same unfortunate mindset. And it was clear, you can tell that it was deeper than, which goes with what Monique is saying, that when you talk about institutions, now we may not be talking about policing in general, but there could be subcultures in different police agencies, in different police units where that mindset can grow. You're dealing with the worst of the worst. You're seeing you're seeing what these people do. You're seeing the broken homes. And this is no justification for what these officers did. Again, I'm going to repeat that because I just want to make that abundantly clear throughout our conversation. It's not a justification. It's just trying to help people understand what might have fed into the mindset that these guys developed. You're going into these communities. You're seeing the homes that are destroyed because of drug abuse, people slinging and selling dope in the inner city. You're seeing all the homes that are shattered when the father or the mom is going to prison for some crimes that they committed. And you know that you're in a position where you can have an impact on that. And if you know that they were with a organized or violent crime unit, wore plain clothes, had unmarked vehicle, and if you don't have the proper mindset going into that situation where you're given a lot of authority. Think about this. As a police officer, the power that you have is massive. You have the ability to take someone's freedom or not. Sometimes you're given that choice. I've been on calls where where it's a vehicle stop or something along those lines. I can impound this guy's car, take him to jail, or I can give him a break and send him on his way. This guy has a warrant. It's a low-level offense, or it could be a lower-level felony offense. Maybe it's like a money-related thing or something like that, nothing where someone is harmed. I can give him a citation to appear in court. I can cut him a break, say, man, you better go to court and get that handled, or I can arrest him. You have so much power and authority that, And not even mentioning the fact that you have the ability at times to take someone's life or not. If you aren't mature enough and don't have the proper mindset, that can easily go to your head, easily. And there have been situations where I've seen that. So for us as believers, I was so thankful that by the time I made it out on patrol, because you can still have the same power hungry mindset in a corrections environment. But by the time I went out to the streets, I was 37 years old. I was pretty much who I was. I knew who the Lord was, and I'm thankful for that. My relationship with God guided me throughout my law enforcement career, especially my last, I would say, 7 to 10 years on the streets was massive. When it came down to, when I saw abuses of power, I wasn't afraid to call it out and speak on it and check that officer when I did see it. I didn't see it all the time, didn't happen every day, but when I did see it, I called it out. I think that when you're dealing with a bunch of younger officers like we have in this situation, a lot of young, inexperienced officers in a high crime area, volatile, you're walking around with your plain clothes on, they got the nice ride and all this kind of stuff, the attention you get from various people. You go to restaurants, people serve you for free. The women are probably trying to holler at you left and right. That can go to somebody's head real quick. And let me tell you something. I think I'm an all right looking dude, but I know I ain't all that. The attention I got out on the streets in the uniform, my goodness. Y'all would think I was like some pop star or something like that on some days. All that can go to a man's head, especially a young man's head whose mindset isn't centered in Christ. It's so easy to slip. I think so many cops, especially here in Vegas, on Las Vegas Boulevard on the Strip, in midsummer, guys will be like, "Hey, Muldrow, we going up to the Strip, man. Like, you coming?" "Nah, I ain't coming." "Why not, man? The babes are out." I said, "That's exactly why I ain't going up there. Because I know me, I know my weaknesses, I know my limitations." And for a young guy in that position, fresh off the streets, some of these guys were fresh out of the, well, I wouldn't say fresh out of the academy, but 2 to 7 years, you're a rookie. You're still a rookie. You don't know law enforcement. And I think they got caught up. And they were in an environment where that was expected. And it was clear, as both of y'all brought up, that this wasn't the first time that these guys had these power flexes. There were too many simple things that I noticed. The way they spoke to this guy from a quote unquote reckless driving call, the way they spoke to him, the way they treated him, pulled him out of the vehicle, threatening to break his arm, cussing him out, everybody screaming. When the guy said tase him, everybody stood back and it was just weird the way they did it. Like, tase him. The guy's on the ground. Why do you have to tase somebody when you got like 5 or 6 bodies? That doesn't make any sense to me. And then there are times where they took off their body cams and sat it to the side and they're having little side chats thinking they're outside of earshot of the microphone, but they're not. Too many little subtle things that I saw that let me know that this is how these guys got down on the regular. And it had it not been for this guy receiving extreme injuries and ultimately dying, we would never even know about this.
Yeah. So Eric, you kind of start to go into it, but based on your training and your experience, what did you see in the video that kind of alarmed you to these guys' level of training and the tactics they were using? Like, how was what they were doing not like within protocol?
Man, how much time we got? You said you only got like an hour and 15, Monique.
Go ahead.
I kept stopping. When I was watching this video, when I was making my own video, I couldn't get past the initial car stop. You were taught in law enforcement, there's a tactic you use. And I know that there can be dynamics that can change things. If you're dealing with a reckless driver, you may, if that's legitimate, we don't know ultimately. I heard the chief of police said there's really no evidence for that. So I don't know whether there's any fact to that or not. But let's just take what they said as legitimate, that you're dealing with a reckless driver. The way they stopped him, unless he was that reckless, was tactically poor. Because you're typically taught to pull someone over from the rear, have a certain amount of distance between your vehicle and theirs, and you approach them in a position and in a manner and in a fashion to where you can keep yourself safe. And if you think that individual is violent or potential which basically saying potentially life-threatening, you pull them out at gunpoint by giving verbal commands to them and have them come out a certain way. You were never taught to walk up to a vehicle, cussing somebody out, reaching inside and pull them out physically. You're not taught that. You're just not. You'll see SWAT teams all tacked out, not doing that. So that right there, that was the first thing. And then once they get the guy on the ground, like I just referenced or just mentioned, you had every cop and their mom yelling and screaming at this guy. It demonstrated a lack of self-control. It demonstrated an inability to de-escalate a situation. And you got one guy saying, "Give me your arm," another guy trying to pick the dude up, another one threatening to tase him, another one trying to pepper spray the guy. It was just chaos. It was chaotic on so many different levels that if I wasn't and the only one that seemed relatively calm or even somewhat calm was Tyre Nichols. He was the only one who wasn't screaming and yelling. He was like, "Okay, y'all doing too much right now." And I just saw that they had a physical advantage over him, and they should have been able to put him in a position. If they really needed to get him secured, there was no reason that many cops should have had any issue handcuffing him. That situation should have never left that first spot. And then they were yelling, "Tase him." So they pulled back. He's able to get up with 5 or 6 or 7 cops on him. This dude is able to get up and take off running. That just blew my mind. On so many levels, there was poor communication, poor de-escalation, poor vehicle stop tactics, poor situational awareness, poor uses of force, poor all the way around. On every level from what I saw.
So would you
go ahead, Kevin?
Yeah. So would you? Because there's a lot of talk on the level of training that police officers get, and I know you were a trainer. Do you think this is a lack of training issue, or like what would you say? Because there's a lot of mistakes made in that video with this particular team. What would you think I know you're not there, you're not in Memphis, but just based on your experience, what would you put the cause of that towards?
We just got on our little private chat there. Someone said bad recruitment. I'm gonna touch on that a little bit. And I know, Monique, you said you didn't want to get into speculation, but I think that there's a historical trail over the last few years in Memphis regarding their recruitment standards and how they wanted to recruit Blacks. They wanted to recruit more minorities. And for someone who was on the African American Recruitment Council on the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, I know how difficult it is to recruit Blacks into law enforcement. The mindset that, oh, you're trying selling out the man, you're trying to keep the Black man down. You might be able to. You're more likely to find Black folks willing to get into corrections, working in prison, working in jail. But as far as being out in the streets, which typically has a higher standard as far as testing and background and all that kind of stuff, especially when you get away from the state level, it can be really tough. So as a result of that, I saw somewhere where they lowered the standards. They definitely lowered the standards as far as who they were willing to bring in, because they still wanted to meet their, I think it was a 2,100 man quota or something along those lines. So just touching on that. But in regard to actual training, when it came down to the officer's ability to just do basic patrol tasks, or policing tasks, I think training all the way around, my personal opinion, training all the way around isn't as good as it should be in law enforcement. I think it meets the minimum, because this type of situation, as much as we may hear differently, we may get some pushback from the mainstream media. This situation isn't the norm. It simply is not. I can share some information with y'all that various studies and surveys that have been done to elaborate on that. For one, I'll say this. According to the National Institute of Justice, hold on, I don't want to use that one. Excuse me. But
and I will say, while you're prepping that, any of the links that you reference, I'll go ahead and make sure are either in the description or in a chat and things like that, so that people can actually get to the receipts.
Perfect. Let me share this one with you here real quick, just off from some information that I read. If anyone wants to look this up, there is a study titled, excuse me here, or a collection of information titled "Dispelling the Myths Surrounding Police Use of Lethal Force," and it's put out by what is known as the Dolan Group, DOLAN. And one of the some of the stats or information that they put out was that on average, each and every year, police officers make 375 million contacts with the public. Police officers make 375 million contacts with the public each and every year. The number of arrests usually end up around 10 to 11 million arrests. So you have a very low level of force being applied when it comes to taking someone into custody, right? Already. When we're talking about issues related to deadly force, with the exception of the last probably 2 years, the numbers stays basically around the same. On average, the police use deadly force around 1,000 times a year. And to give a little more context, we're dealing with approximately anywhere from 500,000 to 1.5 million police officers in the U.S. So we have a lot. I know I threw out a lot of numbers, but I think we can all agree that there's a pretty fair amount of police officers making a lot of stops and making a lot of arrests. And if you look at the sheer number of times where cops use deadly force, 1,000 out of 375 million contacts. I'm no math whiz. I'm not going to try to do the math, but that is an extremely low number of interactions that can potentially result in deadly force. And
I don't want to cut you off, but you said about 1,000 that result in like somebody dying. Right?
Yeah.
But how many of those, because we're being plucked off, don't forget that. So if we're being plucked off, how many of those 1,000 deaths result, like in a Black person dying?
Yeah, good, excellent question. I'm glad you asked that, Monique. That's why
I'm trying. I'm just here for show.
Okay, let's look at it like this. There's another thing. This is from the Washington Post. If anybody is familiar with the Washington Post Police Use of Force database, the information is right there. You can type in a year, you can type in an ethnic group, you can type in their gender, all that. You can type in what the suspect was in possession of. On average, 90% of those contacts where those police officers use deadly force, the suspect is armed. 90% of them. So you're talking about the vast majority of these contacts, regardless of skin color, regardless, the suspect is in possession of a weapon. And this is something that I probably repeated every time I've been on your show, and I'll probably repeat it any other time I'm on it, is that let's not just assume, okay, well, unarmed means you're not a potential threat. Let's not assume that. I'm pretty sure many of us have seen people beat down on the streets to the point to where they were either killed or they were jacked up pretty severely. So let's not assume that if someone isn't in possession of a weapon, that means that they can't pose a potential deadly threat. There are a lot of factors that could play into that contact. Monique, I don't know what your height and weight is, and I'm definitely ain't gonna ask you what your weight is.
We asking. Can you please give the information?
I'm almost 5'9". I'm like 5'8" and 3/4. And
okay. We good.
The numbers,
all right, don't worry.
The numbers is all right, but I'm not a small girl by any means.
Okay, but let's just say you wanted to take me into custody. You're a police officer. I'm the suspect. I'm 6'2", about 225, pretty good shape. Been doing martial arts since I was a teenager. So if I want to get down, I can get down pretty well. Not saying that you can't, but if I want to get
down, these hands, bro. You can have these hands. You want that? You ain't about that life. I'm just saying, you feeling froggish? Come on.
Okay, all right. Now check this out. You pull me over at midnight, okay? You pull me over at midnight on the worst side of town, where you're at or where I'm at. You pull me over. I know I got some dope in the backseat of my car. I'm a 3-time ex-felon. I know that if I go back to prison, that I'll probably never get out, and you stop me. I ain't got no gun, but you pull me over. If I have the intent to do you harm, you had better pull out your gun, even if I'm not armed. Because if I get my hands on you, it may not be a good day for you, especially if I have that evil mindset and that ill will. So I just kind of want to frame the conversation because we hear unarmed a lot. We haven't been hearing it lately, but this conversation comes up often. Yeah. So when we're examining a police use of force all the way around, we can't just look at, oh, somebody did the math up there. I love it. Jeff Davis.
That's Uncle Jeff.
Jeff is on point right there. I appreciate that. I'm gonna have to hit you up, Jeff. You're gonna have to give me Jeff's info right there because I need him. I need a statistician. The pay's low, but I need a statistician. Anyway. But in all actuality, when we examine a police use of force, regardless of skin color, and we can talk about skin color too, because there are numbers that go along with that. But we have to look at everything. But what we have, especially for those of us who profess faith in Christ, we have to be ones who are willing to sit back and take in all information. We have to remember the text that says, we have to remember the text that says the first one who pleads his case seems right until the other comes and examines him. We have to remember that, and we have to hold true to that. What typically happens, especially if you listen to some of these people who have larger platforms, who happen to lean left, like your Matt Chandlers. There were so many times where I would be so frustrated with Matt Chandler, and I used to really love listening to his content, but I saw that he was being so careless and dangerous over the years. When the first time a black man was shot by the police, he automatically assumed race was revolving around it, and it drove me nuts.
Here we go.
I'm just saying. I'm just talking about it. Drove me nuts because
welcome to off code.
Yeah, come on.
This brother's being so irresponsible, and there were times where he was just flat out wrong.
Yes.
Flat out wrong. And
yes.
I don't recall, maybe I'm wrong. I don't recall him ever going back and saying, I was wrong about X, Y, and Z. Let me correct myself and repent for me putting out this false information. No, I didn't see that. And I'm sitting up there, man, you have a massive platform. And but nowadays, that's pretty much accepted all the way around. You don't question if someone says something is racially motivated or something, this is the reason why they did X, Y, Z. Oh, you're actually going to question that? Now you're the problem because you're actually saying maybe there's more to it than that.
Now, see, here's where the conversation to me of power broadens because like Matt Chandler got some power. He has some authority. There's some people under him who are looking to him and to his influence. Same thing with the Gospel Coalition. When I saw what the Gospel Coalition put out about the whole Tyre Nichols situation and where they immediately jumped to, or Benjamin Crump, or any of the people, group or person who has people of under them who are listening to them, who are impacted by them, who they have influence over. You can use your power biblically for righteousness, or you can use your power, your authority for wickedness, for lies, for things that are not based in evidence. And so this is why I'm saying this can be a police issue. It can be a culture of policing issue, but I'm willing to look and say, you know what? I think it's more than that. I think that this is an issue when power or authority is used wickedly, regardless of the person, regardless of the sphere that they're in. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. I'll let Kev chime in if he wants to.
No, I mean, y'all preaching. I'm just in the congregation. So, but no, you went off code when you started name dropping. So
I'm sorry.
Since we went there, we know that it is popular in our culture today, and a lot of people feel pressure that they have to speak up. And this is kind of going to pick up on where we were before we came on air. As to why,
let's go there.
The conversation is basically, where are the Orthodox conservative Christians speaking out when these things happen? I think a lot of people feel pressure to say something whenever these things happen. And people like Matt Chandler have been influenced by people like Eric Mason, who's his friend, And he believes now in the whole idea of everything is systemic injustice, and without any evidence, when an incident like this happens, it is simply proof of the systemic racism. They don't have to have any proof, right? It's just a given. And so once people buy into that framework, yeah, they're gonna speak out every time these things happen. But in this case, it's kind of like I'll say his name. He's controversial, but Jason Whitlock put out. He was like, the officers have been charged and arrested. What are we protesting? Right? It's one of those things of, what do we need to say? Justice is being served. Like, why do we need to speak up and have something to say on this in terms of speaking out and saying I stand against this? I mean, justice is being served. So why would we need to speak out about injustice when the system is working, I guess you can say. And so a lot of times I think people are quiet because, number one, they're waiting for more information, or two, they don't believe that in a particular situation it was an injustice, and so they're not saying anything, because if you say that, you're demonized for not going along with the culture.
Yeah, let me throw this in real quick. That's another thing I've heard people say. Oh, the only reason this has become major news and these officers got exposed was because they're black. That's another thing that I heard.
Yes.
I've heard the whole fact that they were arrested is racist.
Yeah. So
and I've heard this from black people.
So let me just kind of rewind this a little bit back to 2020 real quick, and then talk about how police typically respond. 2020, what happened? George Floyd. And I got a link I can also share with y'all, the timeline for the George Floyd incident. Let me pull it up while I'm talking to y'all, so I'm not just talking nonsense over here. I want to be spot on.
And to go back to your while he's looking it up, Mo, to go back to your
I got it right here though.
On police shootings, I think blacks make up about 25% of all police shootings.
Okay.
So
on May 25th, George Floyd died in police custody. May 25th. As I scroll down, May 26th, so the next day, responding officers fired as protests began. The next day, the officers were fired. May 27th, protests spread to other cities. May 28th, governor activates the National Guard. May 29th, officer arrested Derek Chauvin and charged in Floyd's death. Now, I don't have the timeline in front of me right now regarding the Tyre Nichols case, but I think it was actually longer than that.
It was. It happened on January 7th, and they got charged on 23rd.
So 16 days for these 5 black officers to get charged. 4 days, if I'm not mistaken, what I just read off, for the George Floyd death to when the next day the officers were terminated. The next day. And then a few days later, Derek Chauvin was arrested and charged with their murder case. So if we're using recent history as an example, when people make that argument, that's a poor excuse. Typically speaking, our country hasn't responded the way that we've seen over the last I'll say 10 years or so, 10 maybe a few less years in response to police shootings, police uses of force, allegations of police officers abusing their power. You didn't have to worry about a riot coming through. You may get some local protests, you may hear some news stories, but the amount of riots we've seen in recent memory in recent years regarding a police use of force has just gone off the rails, which ultimately resulted in most police agencies putting this information out there at a quicker rate in hopes to quell and quash any potential violence. So that's primarily what we're seeing. But the first major example, and I'm sure that there are others, but the first major example of someone getting or justice being brought through swiftly was Derek Chauvin, a white man, during the George Floyd case. So I find that argument, that aspect of the argument, pretty weak, personally. I can't hear you.
Sorry, I said I felt like we've jumped into a whole pond of things, so I want to kind of parse them out just a little bit. Going back to the initial conversation that we had before we even came on, I was asking the question of where do we see the biblically faithful, historically orthodox
Mhm.
Christian voice, like mega platform like the size of Matt Chandler, the size of the Gospel Coalition, speaking out against the injustice. See, when like we started this conversation with the biblical standard of justice, the biblical standard for authority, and how people who are in authority should be participating justly with people. What is the way that we should treat people according to God's moral standard? And I feel like there are people like Matt Chandler. The Gospel Coalition came out and called us to reimagine policing and all of that, and
Mhm.
to even look at the word reimagine and what that means in this current social justicey context. you know I don't, maybe they don't know what that word means. I don't really find it helpful. I do believe though that as Christians we can speak out against injustice. My question is where are the super, like the conservative voice saying this is an injustice and this is how we know it was an injustice and this is the way forward because an injustice has occurred. What I see more often, and I would say like Eric, aside from you, I haven't really seen, we're having this conversation now. I don't know that I've seen any other, you know, deep conversation on injustice and what we do from a biblical position when injustice occurs. But, you get Benjamin Crump, you get, him put inside of a church, and now they're having this prayer, and Tyre Nichols is compared to a sacrifice. And, all of these, I don't want to just say Democrat, but yeah, Democrat and liberal thoughts being offered to Blacks that kind of use their authority to pander to emotions. Where is this? And this was my question before we even started. Where is the conservative voice like pushing people toward truth? Or maybe I'm missing it completely, which
I
I'll take
think
that pushback.
I think Kevin pretty answered it partially when he referenced we're seeing justice taking place swiftly. Probably one of the quickest ones I've seen. And if we go back to the George Floyd, we also saw it happen there. But if you look at the George Floyd case, I appeared on many podcasts. Again, we're not talking about any $1 million, million viewer podcasts or anything like that. But I appeared on many where a lot locally even, where people having this conversation, speaking on injustice and things like that. Over the course of this weekend, this is probably the sixth show I've done discussing this issue. Mostly, I would say all conservative, Christian-minded folks, Black folks, white folks, you name it.
Okay.
So from my perspective, from what I've seen, there are people out there speaking the reality, but they're also taking it a bit further. Now, I'm trying to think of who has a really large platform who hasn't addressed this, but I'm not always like on Twitter or wherever that deeply to where I can honestly say that that's the case. I think that personally, I think that a lot of people are speaking out on it, but also they're taking it to a point where what can we learn from this? What the shows that I've appeared on, the conversations I've had, not only have they called this out for the evil that it is, but they also say, well, what can we do holistically as a Black people, as a culture, as a country, as Christians? What can we do to keep this from happening further? And then you start getting into deeper issues, because once we start dealing with, if you don't examine it from a structural perspective and you start looking at the heart of the individual and the family and the church, the local church, I think once you start dealing with that, I think we're dealing, and I'm sure we'll all be in agreement, then we're dealing with issues that will really be able to transform a society. But yeah, I'm not sure if I could say, I could be wrong, because again, my argument may be one from silence. I'm just saying, in the small circles that I have been in contact with, there are a lot of people out there having these conversations.
And that's awesome. Maybe I'm missing it. Maybe I am. And I'll definitely say, you know what? I miss this person. I miss that. But You know,
Well,
I
like, who would
really
you
am.
think of? Like, who's an example? Because like we know the bigger names on the more liberal side. Like, who are some of the people you might be thinking of, like on the more conservative side, like a Voti or somebody like that? You're thinking?
I don't want to give him a pass. Like I feel like he's not necessarily here. He's in Zambia, and so
Yeah,
there's that. But I do look at, I would say, like the Gospel Coalition, because they were so quick to talk about George Floyd. They were so quick to come out and be like, "This is just wrong," like da 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 da, and this is what the church needs to do. And here I just feel like we have another opportunity to really step into something and say, hey, look, I'm gonna put my voice out, and this is what this is the standard of justice. This is how I know it was an injustice, and this is how the church should respond. But I can say, what JD Greer, why doesn't he put something out?
the two things
Where
you just mentioned, you said J.D. Greer and the Gospel Coalition. I said conservative. Were you listening to me? I'm for real. I mean, I'm messing with you on one end, but
I
I
I
was still
know,
going to
but
talk
I
like a
just
John MacArthur or maybe
John
Red.
MacArthur, cool.
Yeah, I know he's been dealing with some medical issues and stuff, but I mean, I don't want to make excuses, but I hear what you're saying.
Here's the thing. It's that we because, and I'll say I make the complaint and the observation that, man, as soon as something happens, you gonna get, what's his name, Van Jones, you gonna get Benjamin Crump, you gonna get Al Sharpton. They right there. Al Sharpton did his eulogy, did Tyre Nichols' eulogy. This man, he don't know him from nowhere. He just gonna come on in and do the eulogy. They make it about race, even when it might not be about race. They make it an injustice, even when it might not be an injustice. So, to specifically bring up the video, or it was like a press conference or a town hall meeting that Benjamin Crump did with Tyre Nichols' mom and stepfather. And they had some other people, like the Memphis, I want to say she's the president of the NAACP down there. Like, all of these people spoke from the platform and all that. And it was all about, collapsing all of the names of Black individuals who have been killed, and bringing people together, riling people together about all of the injustice that's happening toward Black and brown bodies. And it just seems like the Democratic Party, they're just there. The libs are there, arms wide open to ease your emotions while making you a little bit emotional. Because can't you see that whites and conservatives and Republicans and, however you want to name it, they're just there to pluck you off. They're just there to kill you. Now, here we are to protect you. And I'm like, well, where's the other side of that conversation? So that's why I said maybe I'm missing the other side of that conversation. But I really wish that there was a press conference being held by, Black or white or anything else from the conservative side saying, you know what, this is a tragedy. This is an injustice. These officers were wrong. This is how we know. And this is the way forward. Because their way forward is to defund the police, to make sure that we hire according to diversity, equity, and inclusion principles, which is racist in and of itself. Their way forward is to make sure that we say the name, and all that we see the victim or the criminal at times in the position of being a sacrifice. So how do we have the broader conversation, and lead people into another position? Like, there's another conversation, another way to have this conversation. You're not getting plucked off just because this person was killed.
First of all, we don't have the platforms they have, right? I mean, they have every major media outlet there is outside of Fox News, which, no comment. But there's just not really, we don't have the platforms they have. And when you do speak up, if you don't come from the perspective they're coming from, you're just promoting whiteness. If you get up there and you start talking about the breakdown of family, you start talking about how we need to go in and we need to do these types of things, they don't want to hear it, because that's not the ideology that they believe needs to be taken down or addressed, right? They think whiteness needs to be addressed, right? They don't want to have a conversation about sin and injustice. And so we can say it till we're blue in the face, and people do, just not on large platforms. And when you do say it, you get called all kind of names because you're not speaking the right rhetoric. There will be no way we can compete with the emotionalism of Ben Crump and that machine they got running. They prey on people's emotions. And no matter what if we want to stick to truth, we will never compete with the emotionalism that they're using to manipulate not just the Black community, but the country as a whole, in terms of people feeling guilty and need to get on this train and buy into these ideologies and ideas. They are using individual isolated incidents that happen to Black people to push their agendas. That's all they're doing.
But see, I like you used the right word, manipulation, but isn't that also a tactic of power?
It is.
Or authority. You know what I mean? So this is why I'm saying this conversation that I feel like is being put out by the media, put out by many on the left, is so it's so important that we have this conversation, because this isn't a white conversation. This isn't a whiteness conversation. This isn't a conversation of systemic whiteness. Tyre Nichols, I don't believe was killed because of whiteness. I think there's an issue that we as Christians need to discuss publicly about what happens when power becomes corrupt. What happens when power manipulates? What happens when power goes wicked? And why we as believers have to push, urge, vote for righteous power. But the conversations that I keep hearing and the things that keep flowing through my media feeds is that it's all about wicked white power. I don't know.
And you're saying, where's the counter voice to that?
Something like we can't. We just can't call ourselves the church and just be silent.
We're it. This is the counter voice you're listening to. We're it. It's just not a whole lot out there.
We're gonna have to take our show on the road. We gonna have to. I'm gonna call up Uncle Virgil, and we gonna have to take our show on the road, because this some crap. I'm sorry. Like if that like just all fluff aside, if we think as the body of Christ, I'm not talking about Black Christians, I'm talking about all us. If we think that we don't have any power or voice, any authority or voice, we are sadly and sorely mistaken. And we cannot continue to allow people like Ben Crump to go out and siphon off our folk. These are folk, not just skin folk. But this is what happens when we sit and believe this narrative. I can't say that because, well, I'm white, and some bull.
You know what? I honestly don't know. I don't know.
Please, push back. Give me some hope.
I don't know if I'm going to go and just say, well, some folks are afraid to reference this situation because they're, if they're white, because they don't want to be considered. A man was beaten to death, literally. Like none of the white dudes I know, maybe I'm missing it. Like I said, honestly, maybe I'm missing it, but none of the white Christian men, women that I know that I'm friends with, regardless of the level of their platform, small, medium size, or no platform at all, are afraid to speak out about this. I've seen nothing but a conversation, and I have a high percentage of the people that follow me or I'm friends with on social media that are Christian. And I haven't seen anyone afraid to speak out about this issue because they're afraid of being called woke. Somebody actually tried to accuse me of that when I was on John Harris. They're like, oh, okay, I'm out of this conversation because the fact that the conversation didn't even come around to this, but the fact that I didn't say, well, Tyre Nichols should have complied. He said he didn't want to hear the conversation. I don't care what that dude said. I checked him real quick. I said, that's just kind of an ignorant remark to make, especially the fact that that's not the primary emphasis of the discussion we were having today. When I was on John Harris's show, young white man discussing these issues, we called it out throughout. Like, what can we do to prevent that? He's probably, not a major platform, probably 40, 50,000 followers on YouTube, and he's got his own podcast and things like that, on his show having a conversation. I was on a Chicago radio station, conservative-leaning radio station out of Chicago, having this conversation. So I'm not sure, in my experience, I'll say this, the experience I have, which is limited, I do admit, I haven't seen white folks saying that I'm afraid to talk about it or shying back. Now, if you're talking about something more volatile, a situation where they would be called an Uncle Tom for speaking out against something or throwing a question mark about something controversial. I've had that conversation with people before.
Mm-hmm.
Like Eric, I don't want to be, every time I try to defend the police in general, I'm being called they call like black folks Uncle Tom, but they're saying, I'm being racist or bigoted, or, I don't understand the struggle, the black struggle and all that. I've seen that. I've had that conversation on my private chats on many an occasion. But this right here, I've seen nothing but people being bold and saying that situation disgusted me. There was no justification for that. Oftentimes I hear a lot of folks saying, I just didn't want to watch it because they know somebody literally was beaten to death. But overall, you hear consistently, nah, that was wrong. And why would there be any reason? To me, this situation, there's no reason to shirk back and be timid when it was clear. This situation right here, dealing with these Memphis officers, was flat out wrong. We can speak on that. And if someone is ignorant enough, and I'll say it, ignorant enough to believe that you're some kind of a sellout or you're worried about being called a name, then you got issues. I thought I heard somebody eating apple back there. I was like, what the heck?
I'm sorry, it was just my paper.
But yeah, I don't know. I'm pushing back. I think that there are a lot of voices out there.
I don't think on this particular case there's a lot of controversy. I think everybody's on the same page with this particular one. I think the same thing with George Floyd. People were pretty much on the same page of what they saw was horrible, right? But just in general, on these issues that have to deal with race and things, people tend to be kind of timid to speak up if they're not going along with the cultural narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And so even when conservative Christians or Orthodox Christians, whatever you want to call us, speak up, because we don't identify the issues the way the media does and those on the left, then we're discarded because the solutions we're bringing don't align with what it's going to get on the primetime news. It just doesn't.
Right.
They don't want to hear about, Baptist minister talks about the need for, families and marriage in the community. They don't want to hear that. They want to air the guy that's going to get up there and talk about systemic racism and how, black people being targeted by the police unjustly and how we need to defund the police. That's what they want to air. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so we will never, I'm going to say never, but right now we do not have the platforms that they have and the microphones that they have. Right. And so it's just, it's going to be very one-sided because they control the culture. They control not just the media, they control music, they control movies, they control social media, they control every form of information in the culture or that drives the culture. Right. And our counter voice has to be on the ground. I'll say that. Our counter voice has to be on the ground in the community, in local churches. We will never get the microphone to blast across the airwaves. Right?
We're going to have to figure it out. We're going to have to figure it out on the ground and on the microphone. We're going to have to figure it out. Now, let's go to this because Keita put it in the chat that Monique's not going to make it to class and the devil is a whole lie. Monique will be making it to class, so I got to be on time and I will be making my grade. Whiteness. Eric, this whole situation has been blamed on the system of whiteness, that even though the 5 officers are black, they participate in a system of whiteness, which is the structural system of policing, the broader structural system of policing that is basically powered by the system of whiteness. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on that?
It's kind of silly to me, honestly, because like some of the pushback I get is when I was on that show in Chicago, it was a conservative show, but the co-host is liberal, and a lot of people that called in were more liberal minded. So I got a lot of pushback, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was made for some really fiery and passionate, interesting conversations. But I would say overall, when you examine law enforcement historically, and I try to, and because one of the arguments that I got was the fact that cops are basically allowed to do whatever. And there's really no rules or laws that govern what they do. And which kind of goes along the lines of this whole whiteness when it comes to the structural issues in law enforcement or in various governmental entities or whatever they may be. I personally, I'm under the, I say this, there has been, as far as I know, there are not many other organizations or entities, governmental, that have had the massive changes that law enforcement has. When you look at the laws, Graham versus Connor, Tennessee versus Garner, two major laws that impact and dictate how an officer is allowed to use force, when they should use force. When you're talking about state policies, when you're talking about various defensive tactics, trainings, and things like that, that hold people accountable. Now, whether you choose to follow them or not, that's on you. But you're mandated to train so many hours a year, so many hours of firearms training, so many hours of defensive tactics training, so many hours of de-escalation training, situational awareness training regarding how to deal with someone who's maybe under influence of drugs or alcohol or mental health issues. There's a ton of training that goes out there. Now it's up to the individual officer whether or not they choose to follow that or not. And so I think training has always been an issue, like I referenced earlier, and will always be that, because on the flip side of that, you have an individual who has the decision to make whether I'm going to abide by that or not. So we can have laws, we can have policies, we can have all that. But if someone makes the decision that, you know what, screw all that, this dude pisses me off, they justify it in their own mind, I'm street justice, I'm gonna pull that up. And that's when we come back to the heart. So when we talk about whiteness and, you know, the structural system is flawed in and of itself, and we need to tear the whole thing down, in my mind, especially when they're talking about this whole reimagining. My biggest issue with that is typically you never hear anyone talking about, well, what do you do in the meantime when you have people out there robbing and stealing? And just when you provide housing and education and food, are they just assuming that the violent, I mean, obviously they don't believe mankind the way we do biblically. They're assuming that everything's going to change. There's not going to be any violence. Everybody is going to be some utopia where everything goes good. But I just don't see that being the case. I look at it that is, when it's all said and done, it always goes back to the same issue. It's a heart issue of the individual. And there are policies that have been enacted and put into force and in place historically especially over the last 50 years, that has dramatically transformed law enforcement. I'll give you one quick example. The NYPD in the early 70s had over 200 shootings by law enforcement, over 200 shootings. Fast forward to 2019 or 2020, the number of shootings by the NYPD were 26. I'm talking about overall 26. And granted, New York has, if I'm not mistaken, has gained over 2 million people since then. Maybe more, maybe doubled in its population. So you're talking about a larger police agency dealing with a greater amount of individuals, citizens, that the number of shootings went down almost by a factor of 10 over the course of 50 years. Was that because people just decided to act right? No, because there were laws, there were policies that were put in place saying, this is when you can use deadly force and this is when you can't. So I think what I see a wholesale transformation over the years. It will never be perfect because you're dealing with mankind, but I see an overall transformation that's taken place in law enforcement, and that continues to change, but especially because of the potential ramifications for a rogue cop or someone using deadly force.
Kevin, you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just say, when it comes to whiteness and all of this stuff, that we got to stop calling anything we don't like or anything unrighteous whiteness, and just throwing that.
Go ahead and preach.
Right. And then if something is righteous, what is it? Blackness? Like, it's a horrible framework to even try to operate from. But it's just simply just a tactic to take things that they want to tear down, things they don't like, and you can slap a negative connotation like whiteness or white supremacy to it, and it just becomes a tactic to take that thing down. That's all this is, right? There's no such thing as whiteness. There is no system of whiteness. These are very highly educated people who have been indoctrinated in universities into false ideologies of sociology. These are false theories. This whole, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau from the French philosopher, they have bought into his idea that mankind is born good. It is the systems in which make us do bad things, right? And so the person steals because they're hungry, because the system has left them there, right? If the system was fixed, that person wouldn't steal. That's why they believe if we just fix the system, we'll stop all of this, because they bought into this false ideology and they don't understand human depravity. They don't understand the sinful nature of man. And so until we can get to the underlying root causes, or we can believe that the underlying root causes are the same, we'll never be on the same page. They believe that man is good and systems corrupt, and that is it. And so their talk will always be about, we got to change the system, and they've been in charge of the system for forever.
Yeah.
Right? I've said it plenty of times. The city I grew up in has had a black mayor, police force, police chief, city council, school president, superintendent my entire life. And they still try to blame things on whiteness and racism when they've been in charge of for 40, 50 years. And so it's simply just cause change. It's a system to push blame off of themselves because they've really jacked it up, and want you to focus on someone else and say that's the problem, right? It's just a political move to cause change and shove off responsibility.
Let me throw this in here real quick, Monique. I'll keep it short. Let me use this as just a ground level boot on the ground during my time in law enforcement. Time and time again, I would run in, and I'm talking about hundreds of encounters. I ran into people who were homeless, and then we were always given forms, flyers, telling them where they can go if they want to get off the streets or get cleaned up, go into rehab. The opportunities were there, but I can tell you over and over again that there were so many people who just were content with where they were. They loved being drunk. They loved the fact that they didn't have the responsibility of taking care of having to have a job. I had a guy tell me, he said, "Man, Muldrow, I make about $20,000 to $30,000 a year panhandling. Why should I have to go get a job?" I said, "I don't have to worry about any of that." I've seen time and time again where people were they knew where they can go get food, free food every day. If it was too cold, they can go and stay at a shelter for a couple of days, and then they were back out on the streets. There's a reality that there are some people out there who are actually content with where they are, and they don't feel. I think San Francisco is like a prime example. When you see a place where it's nothing but handouts, and then they had a vision to get people off of the streets in 10 years, and all you're doing is providing opportunities for them to stay in their current situation and not develop any personal responsibility, and then you just see it's even worse than it's ever been. People need to understand that there are some people who just don't want better. That's a reality. And if you don't discuss that issue, then you're just not dealing with the reality of who we are, who some of us are, just at our very core.
Oh, we have said a lot.
Indeed.
And the whole homeless conversation is something that I would love to discuss with you further. I worked in homelessness for a number of years on the social service side. So yes, I completely agree with you. Kevin, to your point, I think the heart issue is one that people don't want to talk about. Like, it is easier to cast blame. We see blame all the way back in Genesis 3, when Eve blames the serpent and Adam blames Eve. And so we see the conversation of blame from the very beginning. I will go and answer. Let me see. Candy says, how would you respond to the claim that the origin of the police force was birthed from slavery? Do any of y'all, I have some thoughts on it, but do either of y'all want to hit on it?
I can hit on it. It doesn't matter.
Go ahead.
It just doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. Like, what happened 400 years ago has no bearing on 2023 and the officers that are hired in the last 5 years of work. Like, it just has nothing to do with it. It's an invalid point. It's trying to point to something in history, but no evidence or no way of tying it to the present. They're just pointing at something in history. It has absolutely nothing to do with 2023. And so that's what I would say is just what does that even mean? Like it just.
And law enforcement dates back further than just America. The history of law enforcement is early on in the history of man. I mean, you go to Egypt, you go to Rome, ancient Rome, you go to ancient Egypt. You're dealing with people in put in different positions to protect and serve and defend people. So I agree with you, man. I agree. And honestly, a lot of these people who throw that out there, they're Democrats. You don't hear them talking about the history of the Democratic Party. They're sticking with their party. If they want to be consistent, they would bounce up out of there. But we ain't going there.
That's a whole nother conversation. But I was gonna say both your points is that, what does that have to do with 2023? One, and two, that we can see law enforcement in the Bible. We can see people who were meant to uphold the rule and the decorum
Justice.
of
Right.
of a society,
And what does policing, let's say it was tied back to the first police officer in the United States were slave trade. That was only in the South. You had places where slavery never existed. So we talking about the police force in California is the result of slave catchers. It's logically inconsistent. It just doesn't make sense. It doesn't hold up.
You guys, I've got to go to class. I really want to keep talking, but I have got to go to class. I know it's like a party pooper. Man, I'm like that one kid at the sleepover that goes to sleep early. That's so sad. I don't want to be like
ruin
that.
The party. Ruin the whole party.
I know.
Next time, let's start a little earlier.
Yeah, next time, or we're gonna do it on a day when I don't have no class. Episode 2 and 3 to follow. Hey, I'm up for it if y'all are. Because I think there's so many things that we can branch off into from this topic. Like, like my position is that, corrupt power will, corrupt from any position of power. It doesn't have to just be policing. But then, as believers, what is our next step forward? What's our next move? How do we call those who might be inclined to go and sit under Benjamin Crump at the town hall meeting and get their emotions riled up? How do we call those people over to a different conversation? I think that there's a lot to be threaded through and kind of parsed out on this topic, because I honestly think that that's what a lot of people are asking. Like, well, how do I have this conversation when people are so riled up in their emotions? And if the answer isn't on the big mic, but it's on the ground, well, let's train people on how to have that conversation on the ground.
Yeah. No,
I agree. And with our concern about, who's having this conversation and who isn't, hopefully we can get some of the folks who are watching us to share this video so more people can hear the conversation from a different perspective.
Yes, please like this, whether you're on Facebook or YouTube, like it, and then share it out. Share it on your platforms. We are so shadow banned. It's ridiculous. I shared this video, the post about this today, and I want to say like 10 people saw it. So share, and I have almost 3,000 people 2,500, something like that, who are on my page. Nobody saw it. So share it out. So then people know that there are other conversations happening. You don't have to just listen to this one voice. You're not just stuck with one side of the conversation. Now people asking me about school. I'll talk about school next week on the family meeting. And so I'll reach out to y'all, and we can figure out another time when we can get together again. What you gonna say, Kevin?
Yeah, I know we got to go, but I just want to say, let people know that I'm on a social media sabbatical. So I'm not on Facebook or anything like that. So if you've tagged me in something or responded to something I said a while ago and I haven't responded, that's why I haven't seen anything since early January, and I won't see anything till April. So, but if anybody needs to get in touch with me, I'm on Messenger. You can hit me up.
Yes, and in regards to Off Code, I'm in the middle of writing a book. And so Kevin has graciously agreed to postpone Off Code. We're so sorry, until April, when he comes off a sabbatical, and I should be done with my chapters for this book, so that we can move forward. Yes, Brian, I am in school. I'm in seminary. If you guys want a good seminary to check out, look at Birmingham Theological Seminary. That's where I'm at. And yes, will be helpful. Will be helpful to you in your studying course. And let me see. Okay, I think that's it. You guys, thank you so much. I have got to go because I'm 6 minutes late already.
You late.
Pray for my
And y'all can find me at Code Red Conversations on YouTube,
Yes.
Facebook, or Eric Muldrow on Facebook, Instagram, Code Red Conversations on Instagram. I'm major social media platform. If you want to.
Yes, Code Red Conversations. You guys follow Eric.
Thank you.
And have involvement in his conversation. Support his ministry. Support what he's doing. Yeah, because it's definitely needed. All right, you guys. Talk with you next week. Bye.